recently. Maybe it was something small. They asked if you needed anything, and before you had even finished hearing the question, before you had actually checked, the answer was already out of your mouth. I'm fine. I've got it. Don't worry about me. Here is the part no one talks about. That answer did not feel like a choice. It felt like a reflex, like the instinct that pulls your hand back from heat, automatic, immediate, already done before you decided to do it. Maybe you have moved apartments alone, loaded the boxes, driven the car, carried the furniture up the stairs, and when someone offered to come, you said you had it handled. Maybe you have sat in a parking lot after a doctor's appointment you didn't tell anyone about, and you processed what you heard entirely alone before driving home and answering, "How was your day?" the way you always do. You are not too proud, you are not cold, and you are not simply independent. There is a name for what this actually is, and it did not begin with strength. They told you that you were strong. They said it like a compliment. She handles everything herself. He never complains. They don't need anyone. They've always just figured it out, and you accepted it. Because what was the alternative? To agree that you were struggling. But other times, and you know this version too, they said it differently. Why won't you just let people in? You push everyone away. You act like you don't need anyone. And it makes people feel useless. So you were praised for your self-sufficiency and punished for it in the same breath by the same people. And you found yourself trying to calibrate some impossible middle ground. Independent enough to be admired, vulnerable enough to be loved, needing just the right amount, whatever that meant. Somewhere in the middle of that, you stopped knowing which version of you was real. In psychology, there is a term for the pattern we have been describing. It is called hyper-independence. And it's important to understand this isn't just a personality quirk. It is a classic trauma response. For many of us, this is how we learned to survive before we even understood what survival was. Hyperindependence is a state in which a person has learned at the level of the nervous system that relying on other people is not safe, and has therefore developed an extraordinary, often unconscious capacity to function entirely alone. One of its defining features is how quickly the refusal comes. You do not decide not to ask for help. You are already not asking before the decision has been made. That speed is significant. It means the response is not a choice. It is a program, running automatically beneath the level of conscious thought. This is why people who appear the most capable are frequently the most privately exhausted, not from doing too much, from carrying everything without ever setting it down. Mandai Danle. The fact that you've managed it this long is not evidence that it isn't heavy. It is evidence of how early you learned to pretend it wasn't. Nobody is born hyper-independent. You were taught. Maybe you grew up with parents who were present in the room, but absent in the way that mattered, and over time, you learned not to need in that direction. Or maybe the people who raised you were overwhelmed by their own grief, their own pressure, their own histories, and you could see it. This is what we call an avoidant attachment pattern. You learned early on that your needs were an additional weight on people who were already carrying too much. You became small, easy, manageable, not because anyone asked you to, but because you loved them and you could see what they were holding, and you did not want to add to it. Or perhaps asking for help was simply not consistently safe. Sometimes it was received with warmth, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with silence. And when the response to need is unpredictable, the nervous system makes a calculation. If I cannot know whether reaching out will help or hurt, the safest thing is not to reach out at all. Whatever the specific shape of what you grew up inside, the rule your nervous system wrote was some version of this. Need is dangerous. Self-sufficiency is safety. If you want to be okay, be your own okay. The child who wrote that rule was doing the only intelligent thing available. The question now is simply this: is that rule still serving the life you are actually in? I am not going to tell you that hyper-independence is secretly a gift. It costs you things. It costs you the experience of being helped. It costs you the specific intimacy that only exists between people when one of them is carrying something heavy and chooses, finally, to set it down. It costs you the version of relationships where someone gets to show up for you. Because if you never let anyone show up, no one ever gets to prove they would have. But here is what is also true. The same nervous system that learned to manage everything alone developed a capacity that most people simply do not have: a deep, functional, interior competence. Not the showy kind, the quiet kind. We often see this in what's known as high-functioning individuals, the ones who keep everything together on the surface, but are privately exhausted. The capacity to function alone is not the problem. The automation of it is. The door closes before anyone knocks. What happens neurologically when a person asks for help and receives it is not just the practical resolution of a problem. The nervous system registers something more essential, that the world is safe enough to need things from. That relationship is a place where weight can be shared. Every time hyper-independence prevents that experience, it confirms the original rule. I am alone in this, and I am supposed to be. The tragedy is not the self-sufficiency. It is that the self-sufficiency never stops feeling necessary, even long after it stopped being true. What we have been calling your independence tonight is, at its root, a very old answer to a very early question. Is it safe to need things from the people around me? The answer your nervous system arrived at was no, and it built you accordingly, and you have been extraordinary inside that construction. The work now, if you choose it, is not to tear the structure down. It is to find the windows, to let something in, not because you are broken, but because the room does not have to stay dark. If you have watched this entire video, you already know which part landed for you. You already know the sentence that sat differently than the others. You do not need me to tell you what it means. You have always known. You have just been waiting for someone to say it out loud. If these words found you, stay, subscribe. I'm right here, understanding what you can't say. You don't have to tell your story in the comments. Just leave a single dot. Look at the replies. Every dot is someone carrying the same weight. You are not as solitary as you think.